Preface. This essay or screed or whatever it is was originally written around 2007 or 8 and posted to my now defunct AI fan site where I posted a lot of my fan fiction. When that got dismantled, it went to a friend's website and stayed there till about maybe 2010 or so. And then it went to Facebook. And now that the notes section has been disappeared, I have no idea what happened to that. And now I decided to go ahead and post it here. This is not a defense of artificial intelligence, the film, because the film needs no defense. Let me say that again. The film does not require any defense. There's nothing at all wrong with that film. I'll go into that in the course of this screed, whatever it is. And what it really is, it's a response not only to the criticisms of the film, but to the critics. It's a deconstruction of the critics and the criticism, and sort of a hypothesis about their motivations. At any rate, it's being posted now because, number one, it is the 20th anniversary of a film that I love and that has been misunderstood and misrepresented and criticized for all the wrong reasons by people who don't really understand the film at all. And the other reason it's being posted is because a lot of new nonsense is being posted about the storyline, things that are not supported in the context of the story at all. So I'm going to read this document the way it was written exactly back in 2007 or so. I'm going to interject updates and parenthetical notes, and those will be done in this sound effect. So when you hear this, you know this is an update or a parenthetical note that I have decided to add. So, that being said, with no further preface, facts and fairy tales, setting the record straight on Steven Spielberg's artificial intelligence. Quote, 80% of the critics got it all mixed up. It was Stanley who did the sweetest parts of AI. I'm the guy who did the dark center of the movie. Steven Spielberg. Quote, people can misinterpret almost anything so that it coincides with views they already hold. They take from art what they already believe. Stanley Kubrick. Part 1. Long story short. Quote, long story short is a phrase whose origins are both complex and meandering. Grandpa Simpson. In June of 2001, my roommate poked his head into my doorway and invited me to accompany him on the opening night of the latest Steven Spielberg film, Artificial Intelligence. We still had about 45 minutes to catch the next showing, he explained. I remember that I was sitting at my computer working on one in a series of unfinished novels, most of which remain unfinished until this day. Actually, all of them, I think. And that I was in a pretty dark mood at the time, antagonistic even. I mumbled something dismissive in the shorthand that develops between old friends, something that could be interpreted as, thanks but no thanks. He departed with a grunt that could be interpreted as, have it your way. He was already headed out the door when I had the sudden realization that it might be a good thing to get out of the house and out of my self-consumed head for a while. I still reside there most of the time. Although I have generally been a fan of Spielberg's films, the trailers I had seen for AI were ambiguous and gave it the sheen of an E.T. redo. Not that I thought it was about aliens or anything. It just seemed like one of those suburban adventure stories with a happy ending, and I just wasn't in the mood at the time. I'm not a film buff by any definition, so I had not been following the build-up to the release of the film. And though I was a casual fan of science fiction, I had never read Brian Aldiss' short story. I was also unaware that it was a Stanley Kubrick project, though that information alone would not have made me more inclined to attend. I was just going to go for the sake of going, which, in the end, turned out to be a good enough reason. Needless to say, I was caught completely off guard. There was a darkness to the film, one that was not suggested in the advertisements I had seen. From the moment AI opened, with those slow pans of turbulent waves, and Ben Kingsley's grim narrative about the drowning of the world, the film had the strong tone of a morality tale. There was also a definite philosophical subtext, something moving just beneath the surface of the story, a nuance undefined, but evinced in the subtle arrogance of the visionary's presentation. Alan Hobby was referred to as the visionary in the IMDb page at that time. This was probably to avoid spoilers. In David's interactions with Gigolo Joe, when the older mecha tries to explain to David the oddness of Orga, in the tragic farce of the flesh fair, and in the shocking revelation at the end of the world that leads to David's disillusion. I remember thinking, this is a Spielberg film? Not that Spielberg hadn't occasionally sprinkled his works with such themes, but never had he drenched them so. Then I had a scare. There came the moment when David was praying to the Blue Fairy in the submerged ruins of Coney Island. I saw something so tragic and pitiful in that image. The eternal innocent lost in fervent, futile prayer to a false deity, asking for the realization of a dream that could never be. It was so fundamentally tragic and seemed to embrace the unavoidable tragedy of mortality that I found myself unexpectedly moved. Then the narrator came back, and the rhythm slowed, and the whole scene took on the feeling of a cadence. I remember thinking, no, this can't be it. We went through all that for this? But I couldn't see where it would go from there, and resigned myself to an utterly grim and hopeless conclusion. Then came the third act, the one that would inspire so much controversy in message boards. This was long before Facebook. And incite so much ire from the self-appointed arbiters of all things Kubrick. As the super mecha, or aliens, I will admit I originally assumed, popped onto the screen in their translucent flying device, the once quiet theater began to titter with chuckles and moans. I too was caught up in the immediate reaction. Okay, now it's getting silly, I thought. But as the film went on, I became involved again. I had a sudden sense of where it was going, and that underlying tone of tragedy grew pervasive as I understood that this was the final resting place of all humanity. The game was over. The fat lady had sung her last song and left the building. When David utters those words, "Teddy, we're home," I flashed back to my childhood in hearing Dorothy say the same words, or something similar, to Toto. Tears were kind of unavoidable at that point. I cannot lie. I broke out. I thought, damn it, they got me. Okay, now he's just playing with your head. Feign a cough. Wipe the eyes. Why don't they put warnings on these things? Then came the conclusion, and an emotional impact that I was completely unprepared for, and which continued to affect me for months. And still affects me to this day, whenever I watch the film. But that's another story. It wasn't until the credits were rolling and I was clearing my throat to keep composure that I saw that the film involved Stanley Kubrick. Oh, I said aloud. Now I get it. That's true. I actually said that aloud in the theater. I tell this story to show that I did not go see AI with any preconceived notions. I was not exposed to the source story, Super Toys Last all summer long. I did not engage in any discussion of the film prior to seeing it. Nor was I familiar with the loose clique of Kubrick fans and their misconceptions that are the focus of this writing. In the ensuing month, I would see the film a total of 12 times. After that, I would get hold of a fuzzy but adequate bootleg and rationalize my patronage of pirates with the idea that $150 in 1 month was more than my fair share. Then, for the first time since the old BBS days, that is a internet bulletin board long before Facebook once again, I would join a message board, this time to take part in discussion of the film. That's where I encountered the critics, the flamers, and the smug and quite often pompous interpreters of Kubrick, and where the battle began. Part 2. The Kubrick Heads. That is a combination of the words Kubrick and brickhead, which you've probably already figured out. So, moving on. Quote, I would not think of quarreling with your interpretation, nor offering any other, as I have found it always the best policy to allow the film to speak for itself. Stanley Kubrick. I am admittedly employing major generalities in categorizing the critics I encountered at the AI fan site. There were basically three types. One, the flamers, also known as trolls or drive-bys or just plain dickheads. They are the most obnoxious and the most commonly encountered critics of AI, or of anything for that matter. They said things like, dude, this film sucked, or only idiots would like this fucking movie, dude, or you guys are a bunch of fags and this movie was a piece of fucking crap. Fascinating perspectives. To the extent I have been able to decipher their caustic commentary, the general thesis seemed to be, you all suck, and not much else. Fortunately, they tended to not hang around very long. Since they were not as interested in criticizing the film as they were in simply getting attention, they are as irrelevant to this essay as they are to life in general. 2. The clueless, aka critics without a clue. These were not flamers, but were often confused for them. They criticized AI basically because it was stupid, or the ending was stupid, or Spielberg is stupid, etc., etc., etc. Unfortunately, that was often as far as it went. Even on those rare occasions when their criticisms were better voiced, no rational elaboration could be extracted because, apparently, no rational thought had been employed in developing them. They said things like, what was up with the aliens at the end? And Spielberg ruined the film with a feel-good ending. The fact that they saw the demise of mankind, coupled with Monica and David's death, as a feel-good ending, is troubling, and perhaps symptomatic of a deeper disturbance. It was amazing to see how many film critics fell into this category. I've always felt that the media was very kind in giving these people gainful employment, and in some cases their own TV shows. Such a spirit of charity is what's so great about America. But since the clueless perspective generally consisted of insubstantial rhetoric, they are also irrelevant to this writing. 3. The Überheblich. That's a German word that means arrogant, hubristic, pretentious. The latter is quite ironic since I've been mispronouncing the word ever since I wrote this, like 15 years ago. And I guess that qualifies as pretentious. So that is a bit of a double standard. But I'm an American. Double standard is our middle name. Also known as the Cine Supremacists. Another quick note, that should have been cinema supremacists, but it looked good on paper at the time. In this category, we find the elite of AI critics. They are generally intelligent, well-read, and opinionated, to a fault in many cases. What makes them formidable is that they really know their films. Kudos due where kudos due. They also know exactly how and why AI sucks, and were quick to explain why everyone else didn't get it. They were generally film students or film buffs, or the perfect storm of both. But it is also in this category that we find the Kubrick heads, the self-proclaimed experts on the works of Stanley Kubrick. Unlike the former categories, the Überheblich actually had extensive reasoning behind their criticism of the film. Spielberg is dead, they proclaimed, descending from the cyber heights where mere mortals cannot roam, to grace our humble fan site and enlighten the weeping unwashed. They asserted that Kubrick gave the film to Spielberg as a joke. I'm not kidding, one of them actually said that. They said things like, Spielberg never really understood the story, and therefore drowned essential subtext in a mire of emotional pandering, and He tacked on the sappy ending to appease the appetite of the aesthetically challenged American audience. But they said it better than that. Kudos again. They quoted Jung and Hegel, pointed out the Freudian elements of the reunion. I'm not kidding. They actually went there. That little debate went on for a while. Most of us could only avert our eyes from these confusing references. The basic thrust of their posts seemed to be, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they like." The truth is, I have to be grateful to the Kubrick heads. It was their well-voiced, if poorly thought-out criticisms that sent me on my vision quest to hopefully understand Stanley Kubrick. And it was in their assertions and posturing that I would eventually find their Achilles heel. It can be summed up thus: they can't admit when they're wrong. First, let me give a quick and, once again, apologetically general outline of the Kubrick head philosophy as I experienced it at the AI fan site. Kubrick is God, or if not the God, since, as Kubrick would tell you, God does not exist. He is at least a God. His films are labyrinthine metaphors, wherein every gesture, image, word, song, and even the placement of every object has some allegorical relevance that can only be interpreted by the wizened, scholarly heads of Kubrickian devotees. Everybody else simply cannot understand. This is a hyperbolic interpretation and for entertainment purposes only, but not so far off the mark. Of course, being equally opinionated, I disagreed. My first encounter was with an intelligent, if somewhat delusional, Kubrick head, whose screen name will remain unmentioned. I should point out here that I don't really have any ill will towards this guy or any of these Kubrick heads. I just think they're kind of full of themselves, and I wanted to point it out. His interpretation of the film was constantly changing, sometimes right in the middle of one in a seemingly endless series of bizarre metaphorical diatribes. He wrote extensive and admirably deft essays on the subtext and meaning of the film, wherein he would make dazzling, albeit strained, associations between its various elements and just about anything he could yank from his amply endowed brain. That's a diplomatic way of saying he couldn't tell the forest from the trees. He always culminated these posts with the incessant Kubrick head refrain about how badly Spielberg had screwed it all up. I use the word delusional because there was a constant innuendo in his posts, a suggestion that his information was coming from some sort of AI deep throat, a covert Kubrick devotee that had been involved in the making of the film and was now risking everything to get the word out to the deluded masses about how Spielberg had ruined the project. He implied that he could not reveal this person's identity lest it unleash a storm of litigation, or perhaps the ghost of Stanley Kubrick would descend from above, I assume above, to vex him for all of eternity. He had a beautiful mind. My first sight of the bared and vulnerable flesh of their Achilles heel was in the death debate. It went on for weeks. It's too complicated to detail here, but the short version is, I asserted that David died in the end of the film. The Kubrickians said this could not be, because the end was a dream sequence, and that David had remained at the bottom of the ocean where the film should have ended, and to where they thought Spielberg should be exiled. I pointed out the flaws in the dream sequence scenario, and it went on and on from there. I had a lot to back me up, but since Spielberg was respecting Kubrick's code of silence, mine was just another perspective. Then the DVD came out, and John Williams confirmed my idea. You'll have to look on the DVD for that. John Williams does say David died at the end. My Kubrick head adversary decided that Williams didn't know what he was talking about. After all, he was no expert. He was not a recognized member of the devotees. He just composed the film score. Aha, I thought. I see what's going on here. But at this point in the war, I had insufficient ammo to engage in debate about the way Kubrick was being interpreted. So I got my Google on. That search brought me to one of the major flaws in the Kubrick head philosophy. For those who are still not aware, Stanley Kubrick adamantly refused to discuss his films. He would offer no official interpretation of his work, nor would he argue with anyone else's. As is suggested by the quote that prefaced this section, Kubrick believed that meaning is in the mind of the beholder. Or how about the following? Quote, "How could we possibly appreciate the Mona Lisa if Leonardo had written at the bottom of the canvas, 'The lady is smiling because she is hiding a secret from her lover'? This would shackle the viewer to reality, and I don't want this to happen to 2001. Thus spake Stanley about his legendary 2001: A Space Odyssey. Considering the complexity of his films, his silence left a substantial vacuum in their interpretation, one the Kubrick heads took upon their lofty heads to fill. Numerous and complex interpretations of the film came out. Jan Harlan once said Kubrick responded to one of the interpretations of 2001 with something along the lines of, "Clever. I couldn't have thought of that." I believe the flaw in the way Kubrick devotees interpreted his silence was in thinking that it was his way of goading interpretations, that he was making films from a didactic perspective, constructing elaborate puzzles for the viewer to sort out until they finally got it. Nay, I say. In fact, I think it could very well be quite the opposite. In the last quote, Kubrick said he didn't want his viewers shackled to reality. To interpret his work as some sort of dialectic exercise is essentially shackling the film to a specific interpretation that must be derived through cold intellectual analysis. Being as Stanley said nothing of the film itself, but on commenting on its interpretation, implied that such things limited the very experience of art, it may very well be that 2001 was primarily an audiovisual experience from which many subtexts could be extracted. Or perhaps the purpose of the film itself was to sever our attachment to the linear framework in which most view art. Quote, "I don't think that writers or painters or filmmakers function because they have something they particularly want to say. They have something that they feel, and they like the art form. They like words, or the smell of paint, or celluloid and photographic images, and working with actors. I don't think that any genuine artist has ever been oriented by some didactic point of view, even if he thought he was." Stanley Kubrick. Kubrick was a genuine artist. He was a photographer at first. His art was imagery. He carried this talent into his films, which are rife with unforgettable images. He was adamant in his view that anything could be expressed in the medium of film. Quote, "If it can be written or thought, it can be filmed." Quote, "A filmmaker has almost the same freedom as a novelist has when he buys himself some paper." Stanley Kubrick. He would film scenes over and over, often just waiting for the happy accident to occur. When filming his classic The Shining, Kubrick shot numerous takes of Jack Nicholson crossing a street. He was waiting for something to happen, as he would later explain. In filmmaking, the best laid plans of writers and directors often wind up on the cutting room floor. In our digital age, that would be the deleted scenes section of the DVD. But there were no such things in those days. The process of filmmaking is not static, so no matter what the intention of the director going into the process, it will inevitably be altered by the act of filming itself. Filmmaking is a cooperative process. There are actors, lighting technicians, sound people, editors, and often the weather itself to deal with in order to make a finished product. If I had written this today, I would have added producers and studios and banks, etc., etc., etc. That Kubrick was a master of this form means he knew that process and belies the notion of the man as Zeus. I think he would be better painted as a J. Edgar Hoover-esque character, a puppeteer, pulling strings rather than casting lightning bolts to achieve his ends, manipulating everyone involved towards a desired result. He was notorious for his silence agreements. Often multiple writers would be working on a project completely unaware of each other, in the same way Hoover would have covert operatives acting against enemies of the state, real or imagined, completely unaware of each other's presence. Another recurring refrain from the Kubrickian choir is that Spielberg pandered to emotions, whereas Kubrick would have remained aloof, intellectual, grim even. There is no doubt a real difference between the two filmmakers, and I don't even think Steven would put himself in the same category as Stanley Kubrick. As a matter of fact, I know he doesn't. I've read a lot since then. But it is true that Kubrick respected Spielberg and requested he do the film, saying that he had the right colors for it. I don't think the tossed-off notion that this was a joke will suffice. What is more difficult for Kubrick heads to do than admitting when they're wrong is admitting that the man had weaknesses. Perhaps the reason he shelved AI was simply because he didn't know how to make it work. Parenthetical note, he didn't. That's why he shelved it. I've read a lot since then. I'll get to that later. They claim he would have ended the film with David, trapped beneath the waves, flipping the bird to our expectations and breaking the hearts of hopeless romantics like myself. The reason why this is utter bullshit I will tell you about in the next section, but here I want to dispel this notion of Kubrick as a stoic intellectual. Quote, "A film is, or should be, more like music than fiction. It should be a progression of moods and feelings. The theme, what's behind the emotion, the meaning, all that comes later." Stanley Kubrick. A progression of moods and feelings, indeed. Or how about this? Quote, "The screen is a magic medium. It has such power that it can retain interest as it conveys emotions and moods that no other art form can hope to tackle." Stanley Kubrick. Are these the words of an aloof, calculating mind, seeking to impart some didactic point of view on his audience? Or would they more appropriately imply a man who sought through film to incite the complex element of human emotion, if not solely, then in conjunction with the intellectual aspects of the film's overt and covert narrative in order to communicate his art? The latter, I submit, is the more likely conclusion. To conclude this section, I will use two classic examples of Kubrick head hubris. The first is simple. Excerpts from a conversation on a message board that I believe says it all. These are from 2005, so the Kubrick heads have had more than enough time to understand the story, but AI is getting the usual bashing. These are quotes. "It was great until about half an hour in, until Spielberg's E.T./Hook instincts took over. You are delusional if you think that Kubrick would have ended it like that." Quote, "The ending of AI has to be the worst ending of all time. Kubrick rolled over in his grave." Quote, "AI is a film that IMHO would be remembered as a supremely dark Kubrickian masterpiece if Spielberg didn't spoil it with his happy ending." And I love this one. Quote, "Any film student worth his salt knows that the ending was a Spielberg invention and not a Kubrick one." Oh my God. Think of how stupid that is. Quote, "If the movie had concluded 10 minutes earlier, with Osment underwater pleading for all eternity with that lifeless statue to fulfill his wish, it would have ended on a resoundingly chilling note that, correctly or not, few would doubt was Kubrick's. Instead, someone chose to let Osment have his wish outrageously realized by an intergalactic deus ex machina. IMHO, an egregious betrayal of the film's challenging thematic underpinnings. It came across as the kind of audience-pandering choice that conveyed a lot more of Spielberg's humanistic sensibility than Kubrick's ruleful one." Seriously, this person is a damn sociopath. You'll understand in a second. I guess this last genius didn't realize that the intergalactic deus ex machina was an essential part of the plot and were predicted at the beginning of the film. I would like to at least give the person credit for the pun, deus ex machina, but I don't even think they knew what they were writing. But I digress. Now someone joins the discussion and shoots a bullseye at their heel. Quote, "This is what Spielberg said. People pretend to think they know Stanley Kubrick, and they think they know me, when most of them don't know either of us. And what's really funny about that is, all the parts of AI that people assume were Stanley's were mine. And all the parts of AI that people accuse me of sweetening and softening and sentimentalizing were all Stanley's. The teddy bear was Stanley's. The whole last 20 minutes of the movie was completely Stanley's. The whole first 35 to 40 minutes of the film, All the stuff in the house was word for word from Stanley's screenplay. This was Stanley's vision. 80% of the critics got it all mixed up. But I could see why. Because obviously I've done a lot of movies where people have cried and have been sentimental. And I've been accused of sentimentalizing hardcore material. But in fact, it was Stanley who did all the sweetest parts of AI, not me. I'm the guy who did the dark center of the movie, with the flesh fair and everything else. That's why he wanted me to make the movie in the first place. He said, "This is much closer to your sensibilities than my own." And the reaction? Quote, "I have seen every single Spielberg movie and also every single Stanley Kubrick movie, and I don't believe Spielberg." Quote, "Who really cares? The movie was god-awful, ending or no ending." That's it. No one else responded about this thread. Their whole model of Spielberg as the purveyor of feel-good pablum had just been crushed, and it was revealed that it was instead Kubrick, the master of grim reality, who'd handed over those irritating, fluffy bits to Spielberg intact. Their basic reaction is either, "I don't believe it," or "so what?" or not to respond at all. I know it's hard to talk with a foot in your mouth, but typing shouldn't be affected. Enough said. The last thing I will do is comment on what is perhaps the most egregious piece of Kubrickian hackery. It's called the Kubrick edit. This Kubrick supremacist decided he would butcher the film to reflect how he thinks Kubrick would have done it. I cannot post the film here, but here's the description. Quote, "Over 20 years ago, Stanley Kubrick read the story Super Toys Last All Summer Long by Brian Aldiss. The story inspired Kubrick to develop the film Artificial Intelligence. The basic storyline is very dark and Kubrick-esque, but many of the scenes in the film have a very light and sometimes silly feel that is inherent to Spielberg's style. There is no doubt that if Kubrick had made the film, or even been around to oversee the production, it would have been much darker and without the Disney-esque feel that Spielberg contributed to the film. As a tribute to Stanley Kubrick, I have re-edited the existing footage of AI in an attempt to create a film that I feel is more consistent with Kubrick's vision of the story. I call it the Kubrick edit." Did you catch that? He's going to make a tribute to Stanley Kubrick by destroying his film and then calling it the Kubrick edit. The Überheblich. It turned out to be about an hour and 54 minutes. That's 30 minutes shorter than the original film. Act 1. This act includes one of the Professor Hobby scenes that I removed. However, every scene with the Swinton family I left alone. This is the only part of the story that I know for sure stuck to Kubrick's vision. Good Lord, what a fucking idiot. Act 2. Most of the stuff I cut out is from this act. In addition to scenes with Professor Hobby, Gigolo Joe, and Dr. No, I also removed several lines that no longer made sense after those scenes were removed. I also removed several lines from the flesh fair scene that detracted from the dark mood of the story. The man's ignorance is mind-boggling. Act 3. I cut down this act significantly. There is very little dialogue. It is mostly just visuals put to music, reminiscent of the ending of 2001. End of quote. This exemplifies once again Stanley's comment. People can misinterpret almost anything so that it coincides with views they already hold. This is especially true when they can re-edit the film. The fact of the matter, which will be detailed in the final segment, is that there is nothing at all wrong with the film AI. The Lofty Heads got it wrong from the beginning because it did not fit with their view of what Kubrick would do or even who he was. It ruffled their intellectual feathers. I should have said pseudo-intellectual feathers. Because it did exactly what Kubrick wanted it to do, pull the heartstrings. And, as I am sure any film student worth his salt would tell you, das ist verboten. The pomposity of this re-edit will not be clear until I get to the email exchange with science fiction writer Ian Watson. He is curiously absent from the sources the filmmaker of the Kubrick edit referenced in making his cuts. Watson will casually brush aside all the backwards notions of the re-edit, the critics, and the Kubrick heads. But I'm sure they would simply reply with a haughty, "What the hell does he know? He only wrote the screen story." Part 3. Getting It. I have already admitted that I'm not a film buff. For a time, I found myself befuddled by the criticisms made by the Kubrick heads. I didn't know how to respond because I knew nothing of the man or his works, beside what I had seen in the theater. I even agreed with some of the assertions regarding Spielberg's incompetence in handling the story, and often took an apologetic stance when defending the film I so loved. But then I came back to the idea that Kubrick had asked Spielberg to do it. What was up with that? When I found Plumbing Stanley Kubrick, everything finally made sense. When I wrote my novelized fan fiction of the film, that is not a plug. I did a fan fiction of the whole film, and I eventually recorded an audio version of it, which is up at this site if you're interested. I did it way back in 2003 or 4, and I spoke too fast for half of it, and I overproduced it, and I didn't have great equipment, so it didn't sound that good, but I'm still pretty proud of it. It's up there if you're interested. To continue, I was unaware of the primary writer of AI, and so left him out of the credits, and that was Mr. Ian Watson. He wrote the screen story, and his name is right there in the film credits. It's on the framed poster on my wall, for Christ's sakes. Boy, was my face red. When I found Mr. Watson's site, I wrote him and asked if I could pick his brain about AI. It turns out that not only could he not share the screen story, but that he was actually contractually bound to silence about the film. He couldn't even tell me about the subtext. But there were things he could tell me. First off, everyone should read Plumbing Stanley Kubrick. Get your Google on. It's still out there on the net. It is Watson's memoir about working with the enigmatic Stanley Kubrick during the development of AI, and paints a much different picture of the director than the one the Kubrick heads portray. Kubrick and Watson would meet every morning to work on the story. During these intense writing sessions, ideas would be adopted and discarded quickly. Kubrick was a taskmaster with a quick mind that would change focus suddenly and often. What sounded great one day would be discarded the next, and vice versa. An idea that might have received a scathing from Kubrick would receive a warm reception later. Quote, story conferences were akin to building a precarious castle of wooden blocks or a house of cards, often doomed to collapse towards the end of the afternoon when I was hoping to make my departure with definite scenes to write up the next morning from my pages of scribbled notes. Often it was as if each morning I began writing an entirely new short story, which I was obliged to abandon the same evening, only to start another one the next day. From Ian Watson's Plumbing Stanley Kubrick. Kubrick was annoyed by Watson's attachment to the stories he had developed. The filmmaker went farther to criticize writers in general as thinking their words were written in stone. I can understand this. Written word and filmmaking are related, but two very different art forms. To a filmmaker, the written word is just a diagram. To the writer, the written word is the final product. It is the finished art, not just a blueprint. So while I agree with Kubrick's complaint that writers think their words are written in stone, I do not see this as a detriment. It's the way it should be. Another place where I respectfully disagree with Mr. Kubrick is his idea that film is the ultimate medium. In my view, films are just trailers for books and will never replace them. Books are and always will be superior because they are not static. They engage the reader, who is forced to use his or her own imagination in the process of interpreting the words. By comparison, outside of interpretation, a finished film is static. The images are presented and refined for the viewer. The only place that imagination need be employed is in interpreting the story, and, as the Kubrick heads have shown us, that can have disastrous results. But I digress. If I had written this now, I would have put in a caveat that said it depends on who the author is and who the filmmaker is. I don't think there's any doubt that Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey is much better than Arthur C. Clarke's rendering of the story. But all things considered, the written word engages, or should engage, the imagination better than the static film version. What I was really trying to say is that the written word generates personalized images. These are images you're drawing from your own mind, and your experience is intertwined in the story because you're creating it as you read. Ideally, one should be able to get something new out of the written word every time one reads it again. And if you're not, that's because the author isn't very good. In that case, I guess the film is better. In response to one of my email inquiries, Mr. Watson replied, "Personally, I feel that Spielberg's AI conformed pretty closely to what Kubrick wanted. I didn't much like the Disney-fied Dr. No, but on the whole, I think Stanley would have been very happy." Important peripheral note. Recently, Ian Watson took that back. It turns out that Spielberg did not Disney-fy Dr. No. That Dr. No was actually developed during the period Kubrick had the film. As a matter of fact, Robin Williams' voiceover for Dr. No was recorded when Kubrick had the film by Kubrick. Ian Watson recently talked about that, and recently I mean within the last couple of years. I found it online. You can find it, look for it. But he talks about that he was mistaken. He had forgotten that it was actually done during the period Stanley had the film, and he found the voice recording of Robin Williams and realized he not only found the voice recording, he found the notes that he had used to develop the character, and that was done under Kubrick. But anyway, I digress. You can find it yourself online somewhere. What? Kubrick would have been happy. But the Kubrick had assured me that he would have rolled over in his grave. Wait, it gets better. Quote, "The last 20 minutes, for instance, were exactly what I wrote for Stanley and exactly what he wanted, exactly filmed by Spielberg." Checkmate. But there is more. After reading Watson's memoir and in the wake of our few conversations, I have come to the conclusion that Kubrick relied more on others for story development than his avid fans assumed. This can be evinced in this excerpt from our discussion. Quote, "Often I felt like a sort of fortune teller, trying to guess what he wanted because he didn't know what it was, but he would recognize it if and when it occurred." Ian Watson. To exemplify this, in the final version of AI, an excerpt from the Strauss opera Der Rosenkavalier is referenced. I might not be pronouncing that correctly, but it's the little section of waltz you hear as David and the boys in the car are driving into Rouge City through the statue's mouth. John Williams explains on the DVD that the only instruction he received from Kubrick is that this piece of music absolutely had to go somewhere in the film. Ostensibly, this was just homage to 2001, but there might have been more to it that even Kubrick did not seem aware of. This is what Watson wrote me. Originally, I wrote a scene for Stanley in which little David waltzes with his mother to the Rosenkavalier music. I told Stanley that since 2001 featured Johann Strauss, this next science fiction movie of his should feature Richard Strauss. I'm not sure if that's Richard or Ricard. But much happened between the time of the writing of the story and the point when it was passed to Spielberg, including Kubrick losing the manuscript. No kidding. You'll have to read Watson's memoir for the whole story on that, but when Williams received the instructions to include the piece, there was no scene with Monica and David dancing. Where there is the innuendo of a little joke is in the subject matter of the opera. The Rosenkavalier means the Knight of the Rose. That's knight spelled with a K, K-N-I-G-H-T. And the opera is about an aging woman who has a young lover whom she feels she must give away because she's grown too old for him. There's a lot more to it, and you can check out the wiki page for more. Considering the subject of the story, Watson might have been engaging in a little tongue-in-cheek that Kubrick might have very well missed. Either way, Rouge City, Gigolo Joe, the opening and closing of the film are all Watson's creations, and executed just as Kubrick wanted, sappy emotional pandering and all. That's got a sting. And about the Freudian hoopla, quote, "Stanley never discussed Freud or Jung or atheism with me, so far as I remember. Mainly, we explored narrative logic, not philosophy/psychology. But Stanley was a person who compartmentalized, so he may already have had a philosophical basis that he felt no need to discuss. At the same time, he was prepared to accept any twist or development if it led to a logical, waterproof narrative. What was that Stanley said? They take from art what they already believe. Yeah, that was it. So to conclude this whole thing, let me give my scenario. Years ago, Stanley Kubrick, a man who believed that a film should be a progression of moods and feelings, read Brian Aldiss' short story, and a film began to form in his mind. As it evolved, it would take on many nuances, some that Kubrick would not share, and many he abandoned for the sake of telling a cohesive story. But he did not write the story himself. Over the years, he would collaborate with many writers, Sarah Maitland and Ian Watson being the ones we all know about. But there are certainly others whom we may never hear of. In the end, what we saw on the screen was a very close representation of Kubrick's vision. And even if some of the characters were toned down under Stevens' pen, the elements for which he was so soundly criticized were actually those parts of the story that Kubrick developed with Watson, because that is what the story was about. Stanley Kubrick believed that artificial intelligence is the next evolutionary step for mankind. I disagree with this, but again, that's an argument for a different time. But this was his view. AI was Stanley's attempt to warm us to the idea of artificial beings in the form of a little abandoned boy who only needs love to be real. Pinocchio for the digital age. The super mecha that the Kubrick heads seemed to think should have been left on the cutting room floor or relegated to the blooper section of the DVD may very well have been representative of Kubrick's essential statement in the film, his ideal view of the culmination of the evolutionary process, our mind children that evolve into a species free of the petty and destructive human passions of jealousy and greed, free of war and disease, the Übermenschen, whose existence seems to be dedicated to the pursuit of truth. There is much more to the story, and of course interpretations will vary. All that this writing is designed to express is, if you love the film as it is, bonded with David, felt that emotional response that was at the core of Stanley's vision, you more than likely got it. Thank you for listening. Okay, so this is the epilogue. This part is not scripted. I'm just going off the top of my head. There's a few things I wanted to say in closing. Once again, this is being posted and recorded and posted basically because it's the 20th anniversary of this film, and I can't believe it's been 20 years, man. It's true what they say. When you get older, time just goes fast. And I look back and I go, good Lord, it's been 20 years. And I love the film, and I wanted to talk about some of these issues for people who also love the film, hopefully. If you don't, I don't know why you're listening to this, but if you made it this far, thank you. And I hope you got something out of it. Also, one of the reasons I did this is because a lot of new stuff has come up. And at the beginning of this screed or essay, whatever it is, I still don't know what to call it, I said I was going to hypothesize about the motivation for some of these critics. And so I do want to do that briefly. From my experience, the things I've read and the arguments I've gotten into over the years, I hate to be rude about it, and I don't really intend to offend anybody, but there's a lot of ego involved. There's a lot of people who pretend they know stuff they don't know. And rather than engaging in like an argument or rational argument, they'll imply they know things that we can't possibly know. Or they'll just be adamant about their stance, like those Kubrick heads at that website. Oh, that was just an awful ending. And then when you tell them, oh, that was Kubrick's ending, oh, I don't believe it. Da, 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 da. And that's just sad. It's disingenuous. It's intellectual dishonesty. And the thing I wanted to talk about that's happening now is this dream sequence. It's a more sophisticated version of the dream sequence ending. Now, one of the things that happened that I talked about before was the dream scenario where they said they hypothesized that David was still beneath the water. He was just having this dream sequence. And I won't go into the argument because it's really stupid. It's not supported by anything in the story. And there's a new one come up now where they're saying that, well, the super mecha never really animated the mother with DNA. That was all just programmed to fool David for some reason. Now, you'll have to talk to one of them about their reasons for this, but let me tell you something that's really important to understand. When you're trying to extract any type of meaning from a story, you have to first look at the narrative logic. That's one of the things that Ian Watson said when he was talking about working with Stanley Kubrick. He said Kubrick, he probably had a lot of different things he would have thought about doing with a story, but he would sacrifice anything. There may have been a lot of subtext, within the story that he didn't talk about with Ian Watson. But he said most important thing to Stanley was the narrative logic. It had to be a cohesive story. And that's what it was. And this whole idea of the super mecha reanimating the mother, not reanimating the mother from DNA, but just, programming him to think they did so they could, fool him into thinking his mother was there for a day and then he dies? It doesn't make any sense. You have to extract stuff from the story. If it's not in the story, if there's no nuance, if there's no implication of that theory or that subtext in the story, then just abandon it. Because it's either not there or the filmmaker did a bad job. Because anything you extract from a story should be somewhere in the story. It should be framed within the dialogue or the framing of the shots or even in the music perhaps, but it's got to be somewhere in the story. And the problem with this scenario, I don't know what to call it. It's not the dream scenario. It's a different version. It's the illusory Monica scenario. That doesn't make sense in the storyline. Real simple question. That'll sort of blow it away. Why would these advanced robots, if they could create this illusory Monica, why did they make it last only one day? If they wanted David around, and they surely did, because the super mecha tells David that. He goes to this big old speech to David to try to explain to him why, she's only going to be here for one day. Well, if she's just an illusion, why can't they keep her there forever? That's all he wants. That's all David wants, is Monica. Right? He's programmed with this love that will never die, so he wants Monica. And they have the ability to create this illusory Monica. Well, why make her disappear after a day? It doesn't make sense. None of it makes sense. But they will argue it. And I ran into this when I was having these arguments years ago. It's the same thing. A lot of these people are very intelligent. I'm not saying they're stupid people, but they tend to grasp onto irrational ideas and cling on to them. And when you point out the logical fallacy, it turns into an ego match, a defensive match. So, no, it doesn't make sense. The super mecha would have no idea that Teddy picked up the hair. David didn't know what happened to the hair. If you watch the movie, you see that David didn't know what happened to the hair. He cut Mommy's hair, and then he was getting shaken up by Henry. And then when he left, Teddy, you didn't even see Teddy pick up the hair. Teddy's just standing there. So Teddy walks into the room with Mommy's hair. Where did that come from? Right? Yeah, how does Super Mecha say, hey, look, I have an idea. Why don't we pretend like the little bear had Mommy's hair? And then we'll trick David into thinking his mother came back for a day and something. I don't know. I still don't understand the logic of that. And why that irritates me is it's the same thing that was happening before when I was having these arguments like 20 years ago with these people. Well, not the same people, obviously, but similar types of arguments where people were making these assertions about the film that were not supported by anything in the narrative and the logic of the film at all. So yeah, just watch the film, take it for face value. It is what it is. There's probably a whole lot of subtext you can draw from the film, But don't make up things and insert them into the storyline because you think they're cool. That's not a good enough reason. Yeah, Monica was brought back by DNA. The super mecha even says it. He says it right there to David. The big old speech. It doesn't make sense that he would simply be making that up for some reason to trick David. And the whole point is David dies at the end. That is the point of the story, because robots don't die, right? Of course not. So why did David die? Because the implication is he was no longer a robot. And it's not, in my opinion, this is of course an interpretation, in my opinion, it's not that it's a real, oh, he really became flesh and blood, but that the implication is that is the moment he had dreamed of. That was all he lived for. It's all he needed. And that receiving that love, he became real. And if you watch very carefully, and this is not hard to see really, but most people don't notice it, he takes a breath. At the very last part of the film, it says, and David went to sleep too. When Ben Kingsley says that, his super mecha, you'll see that David takes a breath. And robots don't breathe. So why does he take a breath? Because the implication is what Stanley Kubrick is trying to tell us with this whole film is that if we love these creations of ours, if we develop a responsibility for this life that we have created, supposedly, I don't believe that they're alive, but that I'm going along with what Kubrick said. If we develop a responsibility for them, then they will become alive. Not alive in the sense that we are alive, but they will be a life form. And we can respect them, and we should respect them. I think we should spend more time respecting our fellow humans because we seem to be doing a lot of killing off of our fellow humans and killing off of the dreams of our children and their future because we ignore climate change. By the way, the film starts with waves resulting from climate change, so there's that nobody seems to talk about. But at any rate, that is what I wanted to say. The film is as it stands. You don't need some supercilious, extra hypothetical scenario for it to make sense. And thank you very much for listening, and happy AI anniversary day. I don't think that's a thing, is it? Let's make that a thing. I'll see you in 20 years if I'm still around.